There is a thing many Westerners don't understand about Russia. Many think Russia is just a normal country with some bad vertical of power and a few corrupt politicians on top, or just Ukraine poking the bear and reaping the consequences. Many still buy Russian propaganda. Many ignore the imperial engine inside the Russian mentality, which is older than Putin, mentality fueled by one emotion, resentment. My name is Igor and I am sharing stories of Ukraine and enjoying God's grace and gifts visible in the history and stunning shores of Spain's Galicia. I am working as a missionary authorized for ministry by Sherwood Baptist Church, Newcastle, Oklahoma. So if you live in the southwest Oklahoma City area or think to move there, as Newcastle, Oklahoma is a fast-growing community, and you are currently looking for a Baptist church which preaches sound doctrine and is committed to being a Christ-centered, loving family, please check out Sherwood Baptist Church on Highway 37 in Newcastle, Oklahoma. I spent many years of my childhood both in Russia and Ukraine, being ethnically Ukrainian, born of ethnic Ukrainian parents. My grandparents on both sides were ethnic Ukrainians. I came to Spain in 2011 as a citizen of Ukraine, not Russia. I soon married in Spain, having met my beloved wife at the church where I served. I later received Spanish citizenship. But as someone who was immersed in the atmosphere of both worlds, Ukraine and Russia, and experienced it from the inside, on the one hand, absorbing Russian literature, visiting the estates of Tolstoy in the Tula region and Turgenev in the Oryol region, Yasnaya Polyana and Spasskaya Lutavinova, living in the European part of Russia and in Siberia too, visiting the border with China and Mongolia, swimming in Lake Baikal, setting foot on Europe's highest mountain, Elbrus, and visiting Red Square and Lenin's mausoleum and so on. And on the other hand, being raised in the spirit of Ukrainian patriotism and traditions by my grandparents in the Khmelnytsky and Volyn regions in central and west Ukraine. Hence, I think I can say a few words about what is happening, at least from a cultural or social perspective. Even if I don't have a degree in political or military science or finance, I have a master's degree in German philology and a theological education at a reformed school. I am like a simple mechanic who repairs pickup trucks in a hut in the backyard, who is able to diagnose a breakdown by touch without necessarily a lecture from the department head. So I can still identify outsiders oversimplifying narratives like the myth of one people and other misconceptions. For instance, that Ukraine has no history of statehood prior to 1919 or 1991, or that the 2014 revolution of Euromaidan was just engineered from abroad, but that ignores the very real internal Ukrainian movement and its motivation for its European trajectory. In fact, Ukrainians as a whole identify themselves as being a civilizational part of Europe. But here's the thing you might notice living in Russia, without intending to generalize. There is a descent to, or just amoebism. Russia has a deep internal wound. The wound is that Russia wants to be feared and wants to be central, having not thought of being just another country. By the way, I recently interacted on Facebook with an American. He is an American. He is a pastor's son. Not sure if he also is a pastor. I think yes. About the war in Iran. He looks like an isolationist. He noted that the USA became the greatest empire in history. I am lucky to sit at distance right now, so I may finish this video, but Spain was the greatest empire ever, not necessarily in size compared to British Empire or Mongol Empire, but in terms of a civilizational impact. The first global empire, the empire where the sun never set, dominating Central and South America, parts of Africa, the Philippines, and of course Europe, encompassing Spain, South Italy, Milan, Portugal, Flanders, and the Holy Roman Empire. And it was Spain which laid the foundation of the modern economy with the School of Salamanca, which stood on private property, free market, the supply and demand concept, and value of money and inflation. And the Spanish silver coin was a global currency. So while English brought you all King James Version, Spain gave you all the bank account. Just a brief aside, since I'm speaking from Spain, I love Spanish culture and heritage. For the most part, Spain was once a huge empire. But Russia remains an empire, not in name, but in its relentless appetite for gathering lands and the imperial mechanics of its soul. Having grown from that little principality, Vladimir Suzdal, to become a huge empire until today. You still have lands and diverse ethnicities in Russia which were annexed through history by conquests. But as someone who lived there, I may attest to the presence of resentment, further overheated by the propaganda on federal channels, about having lost not only lands in the 20th century, but the geopolitical leverage that once made its voice indispensable, just as many have been unable to overcome the defeat in the Cold War. I remember being a boy of 12, riding a rattling tram in Russia. An old man had just finished playing the bayan. It's like accordion but with little round bottoms instead of a keyboard like in piano. So when he finished, he began to lament Russia's perceived weakness under Boris Yeltsin. Instantly the car ignited a massive heated argument between those who tasted freedom under Yeltsin and those who felt humiliated. As we reached the stop, one woman stepped off, still shouting to the wind with bitter irony, "Everyone has a seat at the global table, but not Russia anymore." Even amidst the music and the shouting, you could discern the seed of the resentment by people who felt their civilizational weight or military weight had vanished while the world moved on without them. This collective resentment is ideological fuel which marks personal sentiments. I may continue telling stories of localized frictions that mirrored this national psyche. To be fair, bitter animosities may be reminiscent of any neighbors who have spent decades snarling over the placement of a fence post, each convinced the other has stolen a few inches of ancestral soil. And this deep-seated rancor between Russia and Ukraine bleeds into every arena. I remember the atmosphere when the national football teams of Ukraine and Russia met on the pitch. For us, it was a double triumph in 1998 in Kiev, winning Russia. So tensions exist between any neighbors. But in the Russian imperial mind, Ukraine is viewed not as a sovereign neighbor, but as a runaway tenant occupying rightful Russian land. I addressed this in my other video, but when it comes to an empire who will never recognize a neighboring country more than its province, we are talking about a pathological refusal to see the other as equal. When Russians say, "We are a great nation," they primarily mean geopolitical greatness. They mean empire. They mean influence. They mean that neighbors must fear them. Though to be fair, again, Russia has a lot to share from their 19th century culture. Rome gave us incredible architecture pattern. Russia gave us amazing literature, we have to admit it, but many Russians today interpret the loss of part of their empire in 1991, the Soviet Empire, a robbery rather than liberation, like they stole our lands. And this is why the collapse of the USSR was called by Putin the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. Notice that it wasn't the Second World War, not Chernobyl, and notice, not social or economic tragedy, geopolitical catastrophe, meaning we lost control, we lost influence. Well, historically, those lands were not always theirs. They were conquered by Russia at a certain point in history. There was a time when the Russian Empire wasn't there. There was a time in the Old Testament when Jerusalem wasn't conquered by Babylon. So Russia is not just a country. Russia is a country that still thinks like an empire, where Ukraine is the crown jewel. An independent Ukraine is an unbearable emotional loss for Russia. An independent Ukraine proves that Russia is not the center of the Slavic world anymore. That's why they would burn Ukrainian books on the occupied territories. That's why they would re-educate, refresh the Ukrainian children taken to Russia. For Russia, Ukrainians are not a separate people. Ukraine is not a separate history. Ukraine is not a separate church. Ukraine is not a separate language. Not because Ukraine isn't, but because they figured out it that way. Ukraine is artificial. Ukraine is misled. Ukraine is created by Lenin. Ukraine is controlled by CIA. In the other video, I want to speak about the historical lie that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. I will explain where Ukraine and Russia actually come from historically, and why the claim Ukraine has no history is not just ignorant, it is simply propaganda. It's basically rewriting history. I'm not trying to utter obvious things as something revolutionary here, or as it was a major discovery, but I've been surprised to hear some folks in my circles in the New World repeating old Soviet and yes, KGB style propaganda patterns. So if I can help one person see through it, this video is worth making. And again, my name is Igor. I am a Ukrainian missionary living in Spain, sent by Sherwood Baptist Church in Newcastle, Oklahoma. If you live in that area, please come visit. Sound doctrine, biblical preaching, and the church family that loves Christ and loves people. Thanks for watching. See you all again.